You have started something new before. You remember the excitement of that first day, the way it felt like this time would finally be different. And then, somewhere along the way, that excitement faded, and the old habits crept back in. If this sounds familiar, you are not alone, and more importantly, there is nothing wrong with you. What you were missing was never more motivation. What you were missing was a different approach entirely, one that does not depend on how you feel each morning. This book is about that different approach. It is about building a kind of discipline that does not collapse the moment life gets busy, stressful, or simply boring. It is about learning to show up for yourself on the ordinary days, the days no one is watching, the days that never make it onto a highlight reel, but quietly decide who you become over time. Motivation will always come and go. That part cannot be changed. But consistency, the simple act of returning to your goals again and again, regardless of mood, is something you can build, strengthen, and rely on for the rest of your life. Over the next 10 chapters, you will learn exactly how to do that. You will discover why small daily actions matter more than occasional bursts of intensity, how to train your mind before trying to train your habits, and how to turn setbacks into fuel rather than reasons to quit. By the end, you will understand something most people never fully grasp. Winning is not about talent, luck, or constant inspiration. It is about a mindset, and that mindset is exactly what you are about to build. Chapter 1. Build daily habits that outlast your strongest motivation. Motivation is a liar. It shows up when everything is easy, when the sun is shining, when your energy is high and your coffee is strong, and then it disappears the exact moment you need it most. You have felt this before. You started something with fire in your chest, convinced this time would be different, only to watch that fire burn out within days. This is not a personal failure. This is simply how motivation works. It is a feeling, and feelings are unreliable by nature. They rise and fall based on sleep, mood, weather, stress, and 1,000 other factors outside your control. If you build your life on a foundation of feeling motivated, you are building on sand, and sooner or later, that foundation will shift beneath you. Consistency is different. Consistency does not ask how you feel. Consistency does not care if you are tired, uninspired, or in a bad mood. Consistency simply asks one question every single day. Did you show up? That is the entire test. Not did you crush it, not did you feel amazing while doing it. Just, did you show up and do the work, even in a small way? This is the mindset shift that separates people who achieve lasting change from people who start over every January. It is not about being the most talented, the most naturally gifted, or the most inspired. It is about being the person who keeps going long after the excitement fades. Think about the people you admire most: the athlete who trains before dawn when no one is watching, the writer who fills pages even when the words feel forced, the parent who shows up with patience even on exhausting days. None of these people are running on motivation alone. They built something stronger. They built habits, and habits do not depend on how you feel in the moment. Habits run on autopilot once they are wired into your daily life, and that autopilot is what carries you through the days when motivation has completely left the building. Here is something worth sitting with. Discipline is not punishment. Discipline is not about being harsh with yourself or forcing your way through life with gritted teeth. Real discipline is a form of self-respect. It says, I care about my future self enough to take action today, even when I do not feel like it. Every time you choose the habit over the excuse, you are casting a vote for the person you are becoming. Every small action is a brick. One brick does not build a house, but stack enough of them, day after day, and eventually you have built something solid, something that can withstand storms. The problem most people face is that they try to change everything at once. They wake up one day, feel a burst of inspiration, and decide they will wake up at 5 in the morning, work out for 2 hours, eat perfectly, read 50 pages, meditate, and completely transform their life starting tomorrow. This plan feels exciting for about 3 days. Then reality hits. Life gets busy, energy runs low, and the entire plan collapses because it was never sustainable in the first place. This is not a failure of willpower. This is a failure of design. You cannot build lasting change on a foundation that requires constant high energy and perfect conditions. You need something smaller, something so simple that it survives your worst days, not just your best ones. This is where the real secret lives. Build habits so small that they feel almost embarrassing to skip. If your goal is to exercise, do not start with an hour-long workout. Start with 5 minutes. If your goal is to read more, do not commit to 50 pages a night. Commit to 1 page. This might sound too easy, too small to matter, but that is exactly the point. The goal in the beginning is not to achieve massive results. The goal is to prove to yourself that you can show up consistently, day after day, without fail. Once that identity is built, once you see yourself as someone who simply does the thing regardless of mood, you can slowly increase the difficulty. But if you skip this foundational step and go straight for intensity, you are setting yourself up to quit within weeks. There is a quiet kind of power in showing up on the days you do not want to. Anyone can act with discipline when they feel inspired. That takes no strength at all. The real strength, the kind that actually changes your life, is shown on the days when you are tired, unmotivated, distracted, or discouraged, and you still do the smallest version of the habit anyway. Those are the days that matter most. Those are the days that build the kind of inner strength that cannot be shaken by circumstances. You are not just building a habit in those moments. You are building trust with yourself. You are proving, in a very real and undeniable way, that your word to yourself actually means something. Think about what happens when you constantly break promises to yourself. You say you will start Monday, and Monday comes and goes. You say you will wake up early, and you hit snooze 5 times. Over time, this erodes your self-trust in a way that is deeply damaging, even if you do not notice it happening. You start to expect yourself to fail. You start to doubt your own follow-through before you even begin. This quiet self-doubt becomes the biggest obstacle standing between you and the life you want, bigger than any external circumstance. On the other hand, every single time you follow through on a small commitment, even something as simple as making your bed or drinking a glass of water first thing in the morning, you are rebuilding that trust. You are teaching your mind that when you say you will do something, you actually do it. This trust compounds over time, and it becomes the quiet confidence that carries you through much bigger challenges later in life. Let us talk about how this looks in real life, because wisdom without application is just noise. Picture someone who wants to get healthier. Instead of overhauling their entire diet and exercise routine overnight, they commit to one small daily action, perhaps a 10-minute walk after dinner. On day 1, it feels almost too easy. On day 7, it starts to feel like part of their routine. On day 30, they notice they naturally want to walk a little longer or add a few push-ups afterward, not because they are forcing themselves, but because the habit has become part of who they are. 6 months later, that 10-minute walk has evolved into a full fitness routine, not through a single moment of extreme motivation, but through the slow, steady accumulation of small, consistent actions. This is how real change happens. Not through dramatic overnight transformations, but through quiet, unglamorous repetition that nobody sees and nobody applauds, until one day the results become impossible to ignore. Now picture the opposite approach. Someone decides to change everything overnight. They wake up determined, energized, ready to conquer the world. For the first few days, everything feels incredible. Then a stressful day at work happens. They skip the workout because they are too tired. The next day, they feel guilty, so they try to do double the work to make up for it, which exhausts them even further. Within 2 weeks, the entire plan has fallen apart, and they are left feeling like a failure, when in reality, the plan itself was flawed from the start. This cycle repeats itself for years in the lives of so many people, not because they lack willpower, but because they keep chasing motivation instead of building systems that do not depend on it. Understand this deeply. You will not always feel like doing the work. There will be mornings where your bed feels warmer than any goal you have set. There will be evenings where exhaustion convinces you that skipping just this once will not matter. In these moments you have a choice, and that choice defines the trajectory of your entire life more than any single dramatic decision ever could. You do not need to feel inspired to take action. You simply need to take the action, and often the motivation follows the action rather than the other way around. Movement creates momentum. Sitting and waiting for the feeling to strike you is a losing strategy, because that feeling may never come, or it may come and go so quickly that you never actually get anything done. Here is a practical truth to hold on to. Lower the barrier to entry so far that failure becomes almost impossible. If you want to build a writing habit, do not tell yourself you must write a chapter every day. Tell yourself you must write one sentence. If you want to build a reading habit, commit to one paragraph, not one book. This might feel like you are cheating yourself, like you are aiming too low to matter, but the truth is the opposite. You are removing the excuses that have stopped you 100 times before. On your low-energy days, you do the bare minimum, and that is enough, because showing up is the actual goal, not perfection. On your high-energy days, you will often find yourself doing far more than the minimum naturally, without forcing it. But even on the days you only do the smallest version, the habit stays alive, the chain stays unbroken, and that unbroken chain is what eventually produces extraordinary results. Consistency does not require you to be perfect. It requires you to be persistent. There is a massive difference between the two. Perfection demands flawless execution every single time, and the moment you fall short, it feels like total failure, which often leads people to quit entirely. Persistence simply asks you to keep returning to the path, even after stumbling, even after missing a day, even after falling short of your own expectations. Missing one day is not what destroys progress. What destroys progress is the story people tell themselves after missing that day, the story that says they have already failed, so what is the point of continuing? Do not let one missed day become an excuse to abandon the entire journey. Miss a day if you must, but return the very next day without guilt, without drama, and without giving that single slip more power than it deserves. As you move forward from this chapter, carry this truth with you. You do not need more motivation. You do not need to wait for the perfect moment, the perfect mood, or the perfect circumstances. What you need is a small, simple, repeatable action that you commit to showing up for, especially on the days you do not feel like it. Start small enough that quitting feels unnecessary. Show up even when it is inconvenient. Trust that these small, unglamorous actions repeated daily are quietly building something far greater than any single burst of motivation ever could. This is how real transformation happens, not through fireworks, but through the steady, patient accumulation of small daily choices that eventually shape an entirely different life. The person you want to become is built one small action at a time, starting today, starting now, regardless of how you feel in this exact moment. That is the mindset that wins every time. Chapter 2. Discover why small, consistent actions beat big bursts. There is a version of you that exists 6 months from now, shaped entirely by what you choose to do today, not by what you plan to do someday. That future self is not created in a single decisive moment. It is created in thousands of ordinary moments that feel insignificant while they are happening. The alarm you choose to answer instead of silence. The workout you show up for even though it is raining. The page you write even though the sentence feels clumsy. None of these moments look impressive on their own, but they are the raw material of transformation, and nobody tells you this clearly enough. Change does not arrive wrapped in excitement. It arrives disguised as routine. Most people misunderstand what actually creates lasting change. They believe the answer lies in finding the right technique, the right schedule, the right morning routine copied from someone successful. But copying someone else's system rarely works, because systems built on borrowed motivation collapse the moment your own life gets complicated. What actually creates change is far less glamorous. It is repetition, It is doing the same small, useful action so many times that your brain stops treating it as a decision and starts treating it as identity. This is the real target, not forcing yourself through gritted teeth every day for the rest of your life, but reaching a point where the habit becomes so wired into you that skipping it feels stranger than doing it. Your brain is wired to protect energy. Every time you have to decide whether to do something, your brain treats that decision as a small threat, a tiny drain on limited resources. This is why relying on willpower alone eventually fails. Willpower is not unlimited. It gets weaker throughout the day, worn down by stress, hunger, and countless small decisions you do not even notice yourself making. This is exactly why habits matter so much. A true habit removes the decision entirely. You do not decide whether to brush your teeth each morning. You simply do it, without internal debate, without needing a burst of inspiration first. That is the level you want your important daily actions to reach. A level where they no longer require convincing, only execution. Getting there requires patience most people are unwilling to give themselves. In a world obsessed with speed, slow, repeated effort feels almost embarrassing to admit to. Nobody wants to say they are still doing the same small habit they started months ago, because it does not sound impressive. But this is precisely where the strength is built, quietly, without an audience, without applause. Picture someone learning a new skill at work, someone determined to become excellent at their craft. They do not become skilled through one weekend of intense focus. They become skilled through showing up day after day, practicing the same fundamentals long after those fundamentals stop feeling interesting. The boredom is not a sign something is wrong. The boredom is often a sign the habit is becoming permanent. There is a particular kind of quiet confidence that develops in people who consistently keep small promises to themselves. It does not come from achieving something huge. It comes from noticing, over weeks and months, that you are someone who follows through. This noticing changes how you carry yourself. It changes how you respond to difficulty in areas completely unrelated to the original habit, because you begin to trust your own word. Compare this to someone who constantly sets ambitious goals and abandons them within days. Over time, that person starts to expect their own failure before they even attempt something new. The gap between these two people is not talent. It is the accumulated evidence each person has built through their own daily choices. If you want your habits to survive the days when motivation disappears completely, attach them to something already fixed in your day. Do not leave a new habit floating loosely, hoping you will remember to do it whenever you feel ready. Anchor it directly after something you already do without fail: brushing your teeth, making coffee, sitting down at your desk. This removes the need to remember and removes the need to feel motivated, because the habit rides on the back of something already automatic. Within a few weeks, the two actions start to feel like a single unit rather than two separate decisions. And that fusion is what makes a habit unbreakable even on your most chaotic days. Expect resistance. Expect a version of yourself that whispers excuses convincingly enough to sound reasonable. This voice is not a sign of weakness. It shows up for everyone, even the most disciplined people you admire. The difference is not that disciplined people never hear this voice. The difference is they have trained themselves to act despite it, treating the excuse as background noise rather than a command they must obey. The moment you stop waiting for that voice to go silent before taking action, you free yourself from a trap that has kept you stuck for years. Act first. Let the resistance fade on its own, because it almost always does once movement begins. Consider the difference between someone chasing a feeling and someone chasing a standard. A person chasing a feeling only acts when they feel ready, energized, or inspired, which means their effort is scattered and unreliable. A person chasing a standard acts regardless of feeling, because their identity is built around following through, not around emotional state. This shift, from feeling driven to standard driven, is one of the most important shifts you can make. It turns your daily habits into a form of self-respect, rather than a task you resent. You stop asking yourself whether you feel like doing it. You start asking whether it aligns with the kind of person you have decided to become, and that question is far more powerful because it cannot be talked out of by a bad mood or a tiring day. Hold on to this moving forward. The strongest version of you is not built through occasional bursts of intensity. It is built through ordinary days, repeated without complaint, without needing recognition, without waiting for the perfect circumstances that may never arrive. Show up small, show up often, and let time do what willpower alone never could. Chapter 3. Master your mind before you try to master habits. Before you can control your actions, you have to understand what is actually driving them. And most people never take the time to look. They jump straight into habit trackers, morning routines, and productivity systems, hoping structure alone will fix what is really happening beneath the surface. But no system survives an untrained mind. You can build the perfect schedule, and it will still fall apart the moment stress rises, because the mind you have not learned to manage will always find a way to sabotage the plans you have not learned to protect. Your thoughts are not neutral background noise. They are the architects of your behavior. Every action you take began as a thought you allowed to settle, a belief you accepted without questioning it. If you believe deep down that you are someone who gives up, you will find yourself giving up, not because the goal was too hard, but because your mind was already prepared to confirm what it expected. This is the quiet danger of an untrained mind. It does not announce itself loudly. It works in the background, shaping your choices through assumptions you never examined closely enough to challenge. Consider how often a single thought changes an entire day. You wake up and think, "Today feels difficult," and within minutes, your mind begins collecting evidence to support that thought. The traffic feels heavier. The tasks feel harder. The people around you feel more irritating. None of these things actually changed. What changed was the lens you were viewing them through. This is not a minor detail. This is the entire foundation of how a disciplined life gets built or destroyed. Master the lens, and you master far more of your life than you realize. Many people spend years trying to fix their outer world, their schedule, their environment, their circumstances, while completely ignoring the inner world producing all of it. But peace and discipline are not things you find outside yourself. They are cultivated from within, deliberately, the same way a habit is built through repetition. You do not wait to feel calm before choosing calm. You practice calm on purpose, in small moments, until it becomes as automatic as any physical habit you have built. One of the most useful skills you can develop is the ability to observe your own thoughts without immediately obeying them. Most people treat every thought as truth simply because it appeared in their head. A thought says you are not good enough, and instead of questioning it, they accept it instantly, letting it dictate their next move. But a thought is not a command. It is only a suggestion, one voice among many, and you always retain the power to examine it before deciding whether to act on it. This space between the thought and the reaction is where real strength is built. React without thinking, and you are ruled by whatever passes through your mind. Pause, observe, and choose your response, and you become someone who directs their own behavior instead of being dragged by it. Discipline is often described as a battle of willpower, but at its core, it is really a battle of attention. Where you direct your attention determines what grows stronger inside you. Focus constantly on everything going wrong, and frustration expands until it colors everything you do. Focus instead on the next small, useful action available to you, and that action becomes easier to take, because your mind is no longer wasting energy resisting reality. This does not mean ignoring real problems or pretending difficulty does not exist. It means refusing to let your attention drown in the difficulty so completely that it becomes impossible to act at all. Fear deserves particular attention here, because fear is often the invisible force blocking consistency long before laziness ever enters the picture. People assume they lack discipline when in truth they are simply afraid of failing publicly, afraid of trying and discovering they are not as capable as they hoped, afraid of succeeding and having to maintain a new, higher standard. This fear rarely announces itself directly. It disguises itself as tiredness, as distraction, as sudden urgent tasks that were not urgent yesterday. Learning to recognize fear wearing these disguises is one of the most important skills you can develop, because you cannot address an enemy you refuse to name correctly. There is also the matter of self-talk, the constant internal narration running beneath every action you take. Pay close attention to how you speak to yourself after a mistake. Many people would never speak to a friend the way they speak to themselves after falling short, yet they accept this harsh internal voice as normal, even helpful, believing it keeps them sharp. In reality, harsh self-talk usually produces the opposite effect. It creates shame, and shame does not build discipline. It destroys the motivation to keep trying. Firm, honest self-talk is useful. Cruel self-talk is corrosive. Learn the difference, and choose your internal words with the same care you would choose words spoken to someone you respect. Training the mind is not a one-time event completed after reading a chapter or listening to a single lesson. It is a daily practice, just like any physical habit, requiring repetition long after the novelty fades. Sit quietly for a few minutes each day, and simply notice the thoughts passing through without chasing every single one. This practice, done consistently, builds a kind of mental clarity that makes discipline feel less like a constant fight and more like a natural extension of who you are. The mind that has been trained to sit still without needing constant stimulation becomes a mind capable of enduring discomfort in every other area of life as well. Understand this clearly before moving forward into any system, any habit, any goal you hope to accomplish. The mind is the soil, and every habit you plant is a seed. Plant discipline in soil filled with fear, self-doubt, and uncontrolled thought patterns, and even the best habit will struggle to survive. Prepare the soil first. Train the mind to observe rather than obey every fleeting thought, to speak to itself with honesty rather than cruelty, and to direct its attention toward what can actually be controlled. Only then will the habits you build have a foundation strong enough to outlast difficulty, because you will no longer be fighting yourself while trying to grow. Chapter 4. Create a system that works even on bad days. Every plan looks brilliant on a good day. When you are well rested, energized, and clear-headed, discipline feels almost effortless, and it is easy to mistake that temporary ease for actual strength. The real test of any plan is not how it performs when conditions are ideal. The real test is what happens when you are exhausted, overwhelmed, grieving, sick, or simply having one of those days where nothing seems to go right. This is where most goals quietly die, not in dramatic failure, but in the slow abandonment that happens when a bad day arrives and there is no plan built to survive it. A goal is not a system. This distinction matters more than most people realize. A goal tells you what you want, but it says nothing about what you will actually do on the days you do not want it. A system, on the other hand, is built specifically for those difficult days. It accounts for low energy, limited time, and mental exhaustion, and it still produces forward movement, even under those conditions. Without a system, you are left relying on willpower alone during the exact moments when your willpower is weakest, and that is a losing strategy, no matter how determined you believe yourself to be. Building a system that survives bad days starts with accepting a difficult truth. Bad days are not the exception. They are a guaranteed, recurring part of life. You will get sick. You will face unexpected stress. You will have nights of poor sleep, followed by mornings where everything feels heavier than usual. If your entire plan depends on consistently high energy and perfect circumstances, you have built something fragile, something that only works part of the time. Real strength comes from designing your habits around your worst days, not your best ones, because if the system can survive the worst days, the good days take care of themselves naturally. This means creating what might be called a minimum standard, a version of each habit so small that it remains achievable no matter how difficult the day becomes. If your normal habit is a full workout, your minimum standard might be 5 minutes of movement. If your normal habit is writing a full page, your minimum standard might be 2 sentences. This is not lowering your ambition. This is protecting your consistency. which matters far more than any single day of intense effort. The goal on a bad day is not excellence. The goal is simply to keep the chain unbroken, to prove to yourself that difficulty does not have the power to stop you completely, even if it slows you down. There is real wisdom in preparing for hard days before they arrive, rather than trying to figure everything out in the middle of a crisis. Decide in advance what your minimum standard looks like for each important habit in your life. Write it down somewhere you will actually see it. When a hard day inevitably comes, you will not be forced to negotiate with yourself in a moment of exhaustion, trying to decide from scratch what counts as enough. The decision has already been made, calmly, in advance, by a version of you thinking clearly, rather than a version of you drowning in stress. This removes an enormous amount of mental strain exactly when you can least afford it. A strong system also accounts for environment, because willpower alone cannot compete with poor design. If your goal depends entirely on remembering to make the right choice in the middle of a busy, distracting day, you are setting yourself up to fail more often than necessary. Instead, structure your surroundings so that the right choice becomes the easiest choice available. Keep the book you want to read somewhere visible instead of buried in a drawer. Prepare your workout clothes the night before, so getting dressed for exercise requires no decision at all. Remove the shortcuts that lead you toward the habits you are trying to reduce. None of this requires extra motivation. It simply requires thinking ahead one time so that your environment continues supporting you automatically, even on days when your mind is too tired to make good decisions on its own. Flexibility is another essential piece often missing from rigid plans. A system that only works if executed in one specific way, at one specific time, in one specific location, is a system waiting to collapse the first time life interrupts your routine. Build in alternatives from the beginning. If your habit is a morning workout, but a chaotic morning makes that impossible, know in advance that a shorter version in the evening still counts. If your habit is reading before bed but you are traveling, know that listening to a few pages counts just as much. This flexibility is not weakness. It is what allows the system to bend without breaking, keeping you moving forward, even when circumstances refuse to cooperate with the original plan. It also helps to separate identity from performance. On a bad day, your performance will naturally decrease, and that is simply reality, not failure. What matters is that your identity, the belief that you are someone who shows up, remains untouched by a single difficult day. The moment you let one hard day convince you that you are back to being someone who quits, you hand that day far more power than it deserves. Instead, treat a bad day as exactly what it is, one data point among hundreds, not a verdict on your entire character. Show up in whatever small way you can, and let that small action speak louder than the difficulty surrounding it. Review your system regularly, not to judge yourself harshly, but to notice honestly what is working and what keeps breaking down under pressure. If a particular habit consistently falls apart on certain types of days, that is valuable information, not evidence of personal weakness. Adjust the system accordingly. Perhaps the minimum standard needs to be even smaller. Perhaps the timing needs to shift. A good system is never static. It evolves as you learn more about your own patterns, your own limits, and the specific circumstances that tend to challenge you most. Remember this clearly as you move forward. The people who sustain progress over years, not weeks, are rarely the ones who never have bad days. They are the ones who built something sturdy enough to bend without collapsing when those bad days inevitably arrive. Design for difficulty now, while your mind is clear, so that when exhaustion or chaos eventually shows up, you already know exactly what small action keeps you moving. That preparation, made in advance, is what separates people who recover quickly from setbacks and people who lose months rebuilding what a single hard week tore down. Chapter 5. Overcome setbacks by treating failure as feedback, not defeat. Failure feels personal, even when it isn't. The moment something falls apart, whether it is a missed goal, a broken habit streak, or a plan that simply did not work, the mind rushes to a conclusion that feels obvious but is almost always wrong. It tells you the failure means something about your worth, your capability, your future chances of success. This interpretation feels so automatic that most people never stop to question it. But a setback is not a verdict. It is information, and learning to treat it as information rather than judgment is one of the most powerful shifts you can make in how you approach every goal for the rest of your life. Think about how a scientist treats a failed experiment. They do not curl up in shame and abandon the entire field of study because one test did not produce the expected result. They look at the data, ask what it reveals, adjust the approach, and try again with new information. This is not because scientists are emotionally detached or immune to disappointment. It is because they understand that failure is simply part of the process of discovering what actually works. Your daily habits and personal goals deserve the same treatment. Every setback contains a lesson, and that lesson is often more valuable than the streak of easy successes that came before it. The problem is that most people were never taught to separate the event of failing from the meaning they attach to it. Missing a workout becomes proof that you lack discipline. One unproductive week becomes evidence that the entire goal was unrealistic from the start. But notice how much of this is interpretation rather than fact. The fact is simply that something did not go as planned. Everything else, the shame, the self-criticism, the urge to quit entirely, is a story added on top of that fact, and stories can be rewritten once you recognize you are the one writing them. Consider two people who experience the exact same setback, missing several days of a habit they were building. The first person interprets this as confirmation that they always fail, that they are simply not someone who follows through, and this belief becomes a reason to abandon the goal entirely. The second person looks at the same missed days and asks a different question entirely. What happened this week that made the habit harder to maintain? Was the goal too demanding for the current circumstances? Did stress or poor planning play a role? This person treats the setback as useful data, adjusts accordingly, and returns to the habit with a clearer understanding of what needs to change. Same setback, completely different outcome, and the difference lives entirely in how each person chose to interpret what happened. This distinction matters because the story you tell yourself after a setback directly shapes whether you continue or quit. Tell yourself the story of permanent failure, and quitting becomes the natural, almost inevitable next step, because why continue trying at something you have already decided you cannot do? Tell yourself the story of useful feedback, and continuing becomes the obvious choice, because you now have more information than you had before the setback occurred. The setback itself did not determine the outcome, the interpretation did. Shame deserves particular attention here, because it is one of the most destructive responses to failure, despite feeling productive in the moment. Many people believe that being hard on themselves after a mistake keeps them accountable, that harsh self-criticism is what will prevent future failures. In reality, shame tends to produce the opposite effect. It creates a desire to hide, to avoid thinking about the goal altogether, because facing it means facing the painful feelings associated with having fallen short. This is precisely why people often abandon a goal completely after a setback, rather than simply adjusting and continuing. The shame becomes too uncomfortable to sit with, so avoidance feels easier than confrontation. Replacing shame with curiosity breaks this cycle. Curiosity asks what happened and what can be learned. Shame only asks what is wrong with you, and that question rarely leads anywhere useful. There is also real value in expecting setbacks before they happen, rather than being caught off guard every single time. If you go into any long-term goal believing that perfect, uninterrupted progress is not only possible but required, every setback will feel like a crisis, a sign that something has gone seriously wrong. But if you accept from the beginning that setbacks are a normal, expected part of any meaningful journey, they lose much of their power to derail you. You stop treating them as emergencies and start treating them as simply part of the process, no different than a runner accepting that some days will be harder than others, without questioning whether running itself is the problem. Recovery speed matters more than most people realize, often more than the setback itself. Two people can experience the same failure, But the one who returns to their habit the very next day will end up in a completely different place months later than the one who lets a single missed day spiral into a missed week, then a missed month, then eventually complete abandonment of the goal. The gap between these outcomes is not talent or luck. It is simply the decision to return quickly rather than let the setback compound into something much larger than it actually was. When a setback occurs, ask yourself 3 honest questions instead of spiraling into self-criticism. What specifically happened? What does this reveal about the current plan or circumstances? What small adjustment would make this less likely to happen again? These questions turn a moment of failure into a moment of genuine learning, and they keep you focused on forward movement instead of getting stuck replaying the disappointment on a loop. This is not about pretending the setback did not matter or dismissing it without reflection. It is about reflecting in a way that produces useful change rather than useless guilt. Understand that the people who eventually achieve significant, lasting change are not the ones who avoided failure altogether. That version of success does not exist for anyone. They are the people who fell down repeatedly and simply refused to treat each fall as the end of the story. They adjusted, they learned, and they kept moving, even when moving forward looked messy and imperfect. Every setback you experience going forward is not proof that you are incapable. It is simply proof that you are attempting something meaningful enough to encounter resistance along the way, and how you respond to that resistance, not whether you encounter it, is what will ultimately determine the life you build. Chapter 6. Strengthen your willpower through small daily discipline choices. Willpower is often imagined as something you either have or do not have, a fixed trait handed to some people at birth, while the rest of us are left struggling. This belief is not only wrong, it is one of the most damaging myths standing between people and the life they want. Willpower behaves far more like a muscle than a fixed personality trait. Muscles grow through repeated use, through small controlled strain applied consistently over time, not through one dramatic effort followed by months of neglect. The same is true for willpower. It strengthens through small, deliberate acts of discipline practiced daily, and it weakens through comfort, avoidance, and constantly choosing the easiest available option. Most people wait for a large moment to prove their discipline, a big decision that will define them once and for all. But willpower is rarely built in large moments. It is built in the small, unremarkable choices made throughout an ordinary day, choices so minor they barely register as decisions at all. Choosing to get up the first time your alarm sounds instead of pressing snooze, choosing to finish a task before checking your phone, choosing to speak calmly instead of snapping when you are irritated. None of these moments feel significant individually, yet each one is a small rep, quietly training the same mental muscle you will eventually need for far bigger challenges. There is a reason athletes do not walk into a gym and attempt to lift the heaviest weight available on their very first day. They start with something manageable, something that builds strength gradually without breaking the body attempting too much too soon. Willpower requires the exact same approach, yet most people ignore this and instead try to overhaul their entire life overnight, relying on a burst of determination that inevitably fades. Strengthening willpower does not come from occasionally forcing yourself through something enormous. It comes from consistently choosing the slightly harder option in small, everyday situations, until that choice becomes familiar rather than draining. Consider the discomfort of small daily decisions most people avoid without even realizing it. Taking the stairs instead of the elevator, making the phone call you have been putting off instead of sending another message to delay it further, finishing the dishes immediately instead of leaving them for tomorrow. Each of these moments offers a tiny choice between comfort and discipline, and each choice, regardless of how small it seems, either strengthens or weakens your ability to choose discipline the next time a harder decision arrives. Over weeks and months, these small choices accumulate into a version of you who no longer needs to fight so hard against the pull of comfort, because discipline has become a practiced skill rather than a rare, exhausting event. One of the most effective ways to build this strength is by deliberately choosing small discomforts on purpose, even when nothing is forcing you to. This might mean taking a cold shower for the last 30 seconds instead of staying warm the entire time. It might mean sitting with a craving for a few minutes instead of immediately satisfying it. These moments are not about punishing yourself or proving how much suffering you can endure. They are controlled practice sessions, small doses of discomfort chosen intentionally, so that when uncontrollable discomfort inevitably arrives later in life, in the form of stress, loss, or unexpected hardship, you already have practice sitting with difficulty instead of immediately reaching for an escape. Decision fatigue plays a much larger role in weakening willpower than most people realize. Every choice you make throughout the day draws from the same limited mental resource, whether that choice involves what to eat, what to wear, or how to respond to a frustrating email. By the time evening arrives, this resource is often nearly depleted, which explains why so many people find themselves making poor choices late in the day, even though they started the morning with strong intentions. Protecting your willpower means reducing unnecessary decisions wherever possible. Decide the night before what you will wear, what you will eat, what your first task of the morning will be. Each decision removed in advance is energy preserved for the moments that actually require real discipline. There is also a quiet but important connection between physical habits and willpower strength that deserves attention. Poor sleep, constant sugar spikes, and a body that never moves throughout the day all weaken your capacity for self-control in ways most people never trace back to their actual source. You cannot expect strong discipline from a body that is exhausted, poorly fed, and physically stagnant. Something as simple as prioritizing consistent sleep or taking a short walk during a stressful afternoon is not unrelated to discipline, it is foundational to it. Strengthening willpower is not purely a mental exercise happening in isolation from the rest of your life. It is deeply connected to how well you are treating the body that houses your mind. Notice also how willpower strengthens through the simple act of finishing what you start, even in small, unimportant tasks. If you constantly abandon small tasks halfway through, whether it is a book you never finish or a project you leave incomplete, you are training your mind to expect that quitting partway is acceptable. Finishing small things, even things that do not matter much on their own, builds a pattern of follow-through that carries into the areas of your life that matter far more. This is not about becoming rigid or refusing to ever change direction. It is about noticing how often you abandon things purely out of boredom or minor discomfort, and choosing instead to finish, simply to reinforce the habit of finishing itself. Understand that willpower built through small daily choices does not announce itself loudly. There is no dramatic moment where you suddenly feel invincible, no single day where discipline transforms from difficult to effortless. The change happens gradually, almost invisibly, until one day you notice that a choice which used to require enormous effort now feels almost natural. This is the quiet reward of consistent small discipline. It does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives as a version of yourself who no longer needs to talk themselves into doing the hard thing, because doing the hard thing has slowly, patiently become who you are. Chapter 7. Design your environment to support lasting personal growth. No one succeeds purely through inner strength while surrounded by an environment working against them. This is a truth many people resist, because it feels more honorable to believe that willpower alone should be enough to overcome any surrounding circumstances. But the environment you live in every day is not neutral. It is either quietly pulling you toward the person you want to become, or quietly pulling you away. And pretending this influence does not exist only makes it harder to fight against. Think about the layout of your own home for a moment. If unhealthy snacks sit at eye level in your kitchen, while healthy options are buried in the back of the fridge, you have built an environment that requires extra willpower every single time you want to make a better choice. If your phone sits within arm's reach of your bed, you have built an environment that makes late-night scrolling the path of least resistance. None of this is a reflection of weak character. It is simply what happens when environment and intention are pointed in opposite directions. Change the environment, and suddenly the better choice requires far less internal struggle to make. There is a reason successful habits often look effortless from the outside. It rarely has to do with the person possessing some rare, superior level of discipline unavailable to everyone else. More often, it has to do with an environment carefully arranged so the desired behavior becomes the easiest available option. The runner who never misses a morning run likely has their shoes and clothes laid out the night before, removing every small obstacle that could otherwise become an excuse. The person who reads consistently likely keeps a book visible on the coffee table instead of buried on a shelf. These small environmental choices are not accidents. They are quiet design decisions that make discipline feel almost automatic. Friction is one of the most underrated forces shaping human behavior. Every action in your day carries a certain amount of friction, meaning the effort required to actually begin. Increase the friction around a habit you want to build, and you will do it less often, regardless of how much you claim to want it. Decrease the friction, and you will naturally do it more, often without needing to rely on motivation at all. If you want to drink more water, place a filled glass somewhere visible instead of leaving the task of finding and filling a cup for later. If you want to spend less time on your phone, keep it in another room during the hours you intend to focus. These adjustments feel small, almost too simple to matter, but small shifts in friction produce large shifts in behavior over time. The same principle works in reverse for habits you are trying to reduce. Increasing friction around an unwanted behavior makes it naturally less appealing without requiring a constant internal battle every time temptation arises. If you want to stop reaching for your phone first thing in the morning, charge it across the room instead of on your nightstand. If you want to eat less processed food, stop keeping it in the house entirely so that choosing it requires an actual trip to the store rather than simply opening a cabinet. This is not about relying on willpower to resist temptation every single time. It is about designing your surroundings so temptation rarely presents itself as an easy, immediate option in the first place. Your environment includes far more than your physical surroundings. The people you spend the most time with quietly shape your standards, your habits, and your beliefs about what is normal, often more powerfully than you realize. Spend consistent time around people who treat discipline as ordinary, and discipline starts to feel ordinary to you as well. Spend consistent time around people who mock effort or treat consistency as unnecessary, and you will find yourself slowly absorbing that same casual attitude, even if you never consciously agree with it. This does not mean cutting people out of your life carelessly. It means becoming aware of the standards being modeled around you and deliberately seeking out relationships that reflect the growth you are working toward. Visual cues within your environment carry more influence than most people give them credit for. A cluttered, chaotic space tends to produce a cluttered, chaotic mind, making focus and discipline feel far more difficult than necessary. A clean, organized space, even a small corner dedicated entirely to your most important habit, sends a quiet signal to your brain that this space and this time is meant for growth. You do not need an elaborate setup or expensive tools to create this effect. Something as simple as clearing a small desk before beginning focused work can shift your mental state before you even begin the task itself. Digital environments deserve just as much attention as physical ones, since so much of daily life now happens through screens. Notifications, endless scrolling feeds, and constant digital noise are specifically engineered to capture and hold your attention, often working directly against the focus and discipline you are trying to build. Turning off unnecessary notifications, removing distracting apps from your home screen, or setting specific times to check messages are not minor adjustments. They are meaningful changes to a digital environment that otherwise fights against your goals every single hour of the day, often without you even noticing how much attention it quietly consumes. Designing your environment is not a one-time task completed and then forgotten. Your goals evolve, Your circumstances change, and your environment needs regular adjustment to continue matching the direction you are trying to grow in. Periodically ask yourself a simple, honest question. Does my current environment make my desired habits easier or harder to maintain? If the honest answer is harder, something needs to change, not through more willpower, but through a deliberate redesign of the space, people, and digital surroundings shaping your daily choices. Understand this clearly moving forward. You are not separate from your environment, fighting against it through sheer force of character. You are constantly, quietly shaped by it, whether you choose to acknowledge that influence or not. Build an environment that makes your best choices the easiest ones available, and you will find discipline requiring far less internal struggle than you ever expected. The strongest version of you is not someone constantly resisting a difficult environment. It is someone who took the time to build surroundings that make growth the natural, expected outcome of an ordinary day. Chapter 8. Track your progress to stay accountable and motivated. What gets measured tends to improve, not because measurement possesses some magical power, but because measurement forces honesty in a way memory alone never can. Ask most people how consistent they have been with a habit over the past month, and they will answer based on feeling rather than fact. They will remember the days they showed up with pride and quietly forget the days they skipped, until their perception of their own consistency drifts far from what actually happened. Tracking removes this guesswork entirely. It replaces vague impressions with clear, undeniable evidence, and that evidence becomes one of the most powerful tools available for sustaining long-term change. There is a strange gap between how consistent people believe they are and how consistent they actually are, and this gap grows wider the longer someone goes without any form of tracking. Without a record, the mind naturally rounds up. A habit missed 3 times in a week gets remembered as mostly consistent, because the mind prefers a comfortable version of events over an accurate one. This is not dishonesty in any deliberate sense. It is simply how memory works, filtering and softening details over time. Tracking interrupts this filtering process, giving you a mirror that reflects reality exactly as it happened, without the flattering distortions memory tends to add. Consider the difference between someone who tracks their habit daily and someone who simply intends to stay consistent without writing anything down. The person tracking sees a visual record building day after day, and that visual record becomes its own source of motivation, entirely separate from how they feel on any given morning. Watching a streak grow creates a quiet reluctance to break it, not because breaking it would be catastrophic, but because the record itself becomes something worth protecting. The person without any tracking has no such reference point. Each day exists in isolation, disconnected from the days before it, making it far easier to justify skipping, since there is no visible chain being broken. Tracking does not need to be complicated to be effective. In fact, the simplest tracking methods tend to work best, precisely because they require so little effort that they never become a barrier of their own. A single checkmark on a calendar, a simple tally in a notebook, a basic note recording whether the habit happened that day. These small acts take seconds to complete, yet provide enormous clarity over time. The goal is not to create an elaborate system requiring hours of maintenance. The goal is to create a record honest enough and simple enough that you will actually maintain it, because a complicated tracking system abandoned after 2 weeks provides no value at all. Beyond simply marking whether a habit happened, there is real value in tracking small details surrounding your effort, particularly on the days that felt hardest. Note briefly what made a certain day difficult, whether it was exhaustion, stress, or an unexpected disruption to your usual schedule. Over weeks and months, patterns begin to emerge from these small notes, patterns you would likely never notice without a written record to compare against. Perhaps a particular habit consistently becomes difficult on the same day each week, revealing a scheduling conflict worth addressing directly. Perhaps energy dips at a specific time of day, suggesting a need to shift the habit earlier or later. These patterns, invisible in the moment, become obvious once tracked, and this awareness allows you to adjust your approach based on evidence rather than guesswork. Accountability strengthens considerably once progress becomes visible, not only to yourself, but sometimes to others as well. There is something about knowing another person will see whether you followed through that adds a layer of commitment difficult to replicate alone. This does not require a formal arrangement or constant check-ins. Something as simple as sharing your goal with one trusted person and briefly updating them on your progress occasionally creates a mild but effective form of accountability. Most people find it easier to break a promise made silently to themselves than a promise witnessed by someone else, and using this tendency intentionally can provide extra support during the weeks when internal motivation feels particularly low. Progress tracking also protects against a particular danger that tends to strike right in the middle of any long-term effort, the point where initial excitement has faded, but visible results have not yet fully arrived. This middle stretch is where most people quietly give up, convinced that nothing is happening simply because change feels invisible day to day. A tracked record fights directly against this false perception. Looking back at 30 consecutive days marked on a calendar provides undeniable proof of effort, even during a stretch where physical or external results have not yet caught up. This proof becomes essential fuel precisely when motivation naturally runs lowest, offering evidence that effort has been real and consistent, even when outcomes are still developing beneath the surface. There is an important distinction worth making between tracking for accountability and tracking for punishment. Some people turn their tracking system into a source of constant self-criticism, staring at missed days with shame rather than curiosity, which eventually makes the entire practice feel unbearable enough to abandon. A missed day on a tracker is not evidence of failure. It is simply information, a data point worth noting without attaching excessive judgment to it. Approach your tracking record the way a coach might review game footage, looking honestly at what happened without spiraling into harsh self-attack. This mindset keeps tracking sustainable over the long stretches of time where real transformation actually takes place. Celebrating small milestones along the way matters more than many people realize, and a tracking record makes these milestones far easier to notice and acknowledge. Reaching 7 consecutive days, then 30 days, then 90 days, each of these markers deserves a moment of genuine recognition, not because the habit is complete, but because sustained effort deserves acknowledgement along the journey, not only once some distant final goal has been reached. This recognition does not require anything elaborate. A brief moment of genuine pride, noticing how far consistency has carried you, reinforces the entire process and makes continuing feel worthwhile even before the ultimate goal has been achieved. Understand that tracking your progress is not about obsessively measuring every detail of your life or turning personal growth into a rigid, joyless exercise in data collection. It is about creating enough honest visibility into your own effort that motivation stops being the only force keeping you moving forward. When you can see your progress laid out clearly in front of you, undeniable and real, continuing becomes far less about how you feel in any single moment and far more about honoring the record you have already begun building, one honest day at a time. Chapter 9. Silence, self-doubt, and replace it with quiet confidence. Self-doubt rarely arrives as a loud, obvious enemy. It slips in quietly, disguised as caution, as realism, as simply being honest about your limitations. This is what makes it so difficult to fight. If self-doubt announced itself clearly, most people would recognize it instantly and refuse to listen. Instead, it whispers reasonable-sounding sentences, telling you that you are simply being practical, that you are protecting yourself from disappointment, that wanting less is somehow wiser than wanting more. Learning to recognize this voice for what it actually is, rather than accepting it as objective truth, is the first real step towards silencing it. Notice how self-doubt almost always speaks in absolutes, even though it presents itself as measured and reasonable. It says you always struggle with this, or you never follow through, or this simply is not for someone like you. These statements sound like conclusions drawn from careful observation, but they are usually nothing more than old fears repeating themselves in a new situation. The mind clings to familiar narratives, even painful ones, because familiar feels safer than uncertain, even when that familiar narrative is actively holding you back from something you genuinely want. Confidence is often misunderstood as the absence of doubt entirely, as though confident people simply do not experience these internal challenges the way everyone else does. This misunderstanding causes enormous unnecessary suffering because people assume something is uniquely wrong with them every time doubt appears, when in reality, doubt appears for nearly everyone attempting anything meaningful. The difference between someone who appears confident and someone paralyzed by doubt is rarely the presence or absence of the doubtful thought itself. The difference lies in what each person chooses to do immediately after that thought arrives. Quiet confidence, the kind that actually sustains a person through difficulty, is built very differently from the loud, performative confidence, often celebrated in public. Quiet confidence does not require constant external validation or applause to remain intact. It grows instead from a private, internal record of promises kept to yourself, evidence accumulated slowly through consistent action rather than through anyone else's opinion. Every time you say you will do something and then follow through, even in a small, unnoticed way, you are making a deposit into this internal account. Withdraw from that account by breaking promises to yourself repeatedly, and doubt naturally grows stronger, filling the space where trust used to exist. This means the fastest way to weaken chronic self-doubt is not through motivational speeches or forced positive thinking, methods that often feel hollow because they attempt to override doubt with words alone. The fastest way is through small, consistent proof, gathered patiently over time, through action rather than affirmation. Tell yourself you are capable as many times as you like, but if your daily behavior contradicts that statement, some part of you will always know the words are hollow. Follow through on one small commitment after another, and eventually, the belief in your own capability stops requiring convincing altogether, because it has become something demonstrated rather than merely claimed. Comparison deserves particular attention here, since it quietly fuels an enormous amount of self-doubt that would otherwise never exist on its own. Left alone, most people can recognize their own steady progress clearly. Introduce constant comparison to others, especially through carefully curated versions of other people's lives, and that same steady progress suddenly feels inadequate, regardless of how much genuine growth has actually occurred. Doubt rarely originates from an honest look at your own journey. It usually originates from measuring your unfinished middle against someone else's polished beginning or highlighted success, a comparison that was never fair in the first place. There is real value in separating the identity of who you are becoming from the noise of a single difficult moment or a single critical thought. A moment of doubt is not a permanent condition, no matter how convincing it feels while you are inside it. Treat doubt as weather passing through, rather than as the climate defining your entire existence. Weather changes constantly, sometimes within hours, while climate represents a much longer, more stable pattern. The mistake many people make is treating a temporary storm of doubt as though it reveals some fixed, unchangeable truth about their permanent character, when in reality it usually reflects nothing more than a difficult moment that will pass if given enough time and enough continued action. Self-doubt also tends to grow stronger in silence, in the private space of your own thoughts where no one else can offer perspective or challenge distorted thinking. Speaking doubt aloud to someone trustworthy often reveals immediately how exaggerated or unfounded it actually was. A fear that felt enormous and undeniable while trapped inside your own head frequently sounds smaller, even slightly irrational, once spoken out loud to another person. This does not mean seeking constant reassurance from others to feel adequate. It means recognizing that doubt often loses much of its power the moment it is exposed to honest outside perspective, rather than left to grow unchecked in isolation. Physical posture and daily behavior influence internal confidence more than most people realize, creating a feedback loop that works in both directions. Moving through your day with intention, completing tasks fully rather than half finishing them, speaking clearly rather than mumbling through uncertainty, All of these small physical choices send a signal back to your own mind about who you are. You do not need to feel confident first in order to act with confidence. Often, acting deliberately, even while doubt is still present internally, is exactly what produces the feeling of confidence afterward, rather than the other way around. Replacing self-doubt with quiet confidence is not a single event completed once and permanently finished. It is an ongoing practice, built through the accumulation of kept promises, honest self-talk, reduced comparison, and consistent action taken even while doubt is still whispering in the background. There will always be new situations capable of triggering old, familiar doubt. New challenges that feel unfamiliar enough to reawaken that quiet, cautious voice. The goal is not to eliminate this voice completely, since it may never disappear entirely. The goal is to grow strong enough, through consistent proof gathered over time, that the voice no longer controls your actions, even when it still occasionally shows up to speak. Chapter 10. Commit to lifelong growth and become unstoppable forever. There is no finish line waiting for you at the end of this journey, and understanding this fully changes everything about how you approach the rest of your life. Many people quietly believe that growth is something you complete, a project with a defined endpoint after which you finally arrive, finally relax, finally stop needing to put in effort. This belief sets people up for a strange kind of disappointment even after achieving real success, because the moment they reach one goal, life simply presents another challenge, another mountain, another version of the same fundamental question about how they intend to respond to difficulty. Growth was never meant to end. It was meant to become a permanent part of how you move through every stage of your life. Consider what happens to anything that stops growing. A tree that stops growing does not simply stay the same. It begins to decay, slowly at first, then more noticeably over time. The same principle applies to skills, relationships, health, and character. Standing still is never actually neutral, even though it feels that way in the moment. Without continued effort, without continued learning and adjustment, things naturally drift backward, not because anyone intended for that decline to happen, but because maintenance requires ongoing attention and growth requires even more. The habits you have built throughout this book are not a destination reached and then abandoned. They are a way of living that must continue, adapting as your circumstances change, for as long as you want to keep becoming a stronger version of yourself. There is a particular danger that arrives after initial success, a danger far more subtle than the struggles faced at the very beginning of any journey. Early on, difficulty is obvious and expected, which makes it easier to stay alert and committed. But after months or years of consistent effort, once real progress has been made, complacency often creeps in quietly, disguised as well-earned rest. This is not to say rest itself is dangerous, since genuine rest is necessary and valuable. The danger lies in mistaking permanent comfort for temporary recovery, in letting one well-deserved break slowly extend into a complete abandonment of the habits that created the progress in the first place. Guard against this by staying honest with yourself about the difference between resting to recharge and quietly giving up disguised as rest. Becoming unstoppable does not mean becoming someone who never struggles, never doubts, or never faces circumstances that feel overwhelming. That version of unstoppable does not exist for any human being, regardless of how composed they may appear from the outside. Becoming unstoppable means becoming someone who no longer requires perfect conditions in order to continue moving forward. It means developing enough internal strength, enough proven trust in your own follow-through, that difficult circumstances slow you down without ever fully stopping you. This is a far more realistic and far more powerful goal than chasing some fantasy version of a person who feels nothing and struggles with nothing, because that fantasy was never true for anyone who accomplished anything meaningful. Every principle explored throughout this book, showing up regardless of motivation, mastering your own mind, building systems that survive hard days, treating failure as feedback, strengthening willpower through small choices, designing a supportive environment, tracking honest progress, and replacing doubt with quiet confidence. All of these principles work together as a single, interconnected way of living, rather than separate, isolated techniques. Removing any one of them weakens the entire structure. Together, they form a foundation strong enough to support real, lasting transformation, not the temporary kind that fades within weeks, but the kind that quietly reshapes an entire life over years of consistent, patient effort. Understand that lifelong growth will not always feel exciting, and this expectation matters more than it might initially seem. The early stages of any new goal often carry genuine excitement, a sense of fresh possibility that makes effort feel almost easy. This excitement fades eventually, and it fades for everyone, regardless of how meaningful the goal actually is. What separates people who sustain growth for decades from people who abandon it after a single burst of enthusiasm is not the presence of ongoing excitement. It is the willingness to continue showing up long after that initial excitement has completely disappeared, trusting the process itself rather than depending on a feeling that was never designed to last. There will be seasons in your life that demand more from you than others, seasons of loss, exhaustion, uncertainty, or overwhelming responsibility. During these seasons, growth may look different than it did during easier periods. It may shrink temporarily to its smallest, most minimal form, simply showing up in whatever small way remains possible under difficult circumstances. This is not failure. This is wisdom, the understanding that consistency does not require identical effort every single day for the rest of your life. It requires continued presence, continued commitment to the path itself, even when the specific actions along that path must temporarily adjust to match what life is currently demanding of you. Becoming unstoppable, in the truest sense, is less about speed and more about refusal, a quiet, steady refusal to fully stop, regardless of how many times circumstances knock you off course. You will be knocked off course. This is not a possibility to prepare for cautiously. It is a guarantee woven into the nature of any long, meaningful journey. The question was never whether you would face difficulty capable of interrupting your progress. The question has always been whether you would allow that interruption to become permanent, or whether you would treat it as exactly what it is, a temporary pause within a much longer story, still very much being written. As you move forward from everything explored in this book, carry this final understanding with you above all else. You do not need to feel ready, motivated, or completely confident in order to keep going. You simply need to keep returning to the small, consistent actions that build the life you actually want, day after day, especially on the days that offer no applause, no visible progress, and no immediate reward. This quiet, patient return, repeated for years rather than weeks, is what ultimately separates a temporary phase of self-improvement from a permanent transformation of character. The mindset that wins every time was never about winning quickly. It was always about refusing to stop, one ordinary day after another, for as long as it takes to become the person you were always capable of becoming.